I have a confession. I don't know if this is a confession or not, but I have something to tell you, and this is true. I am legitimately nervous about this message this morning. That's true. Like I am legitimately nervous, and I'll tell you why. Because we're going to talk about money, and you know that sometimes that can get weird, right? We've all maybe experienced that, or been in a church, I don't know, but so I'm a little nervous about talking about money because of the potential weirdness that's involved in that, and the thing that's really on my mind is I don't want to talk about this in such a way that would give somebody who's new or somebody who's watching for the first time, or maybe there's somebody who said, you know what, I'm willing to give church one more try. I'm willing to give Jesus one more try. And they show up and it's like, oh, there it is. They just want my money. That's what it's all about, And so I'm kind of in this tension of like, okay. On the other hand, I'm really excited to talk about this because one, the scriptures talk about money. And the scriptures have much to say to us about our money. And so I'm excited to teach the scriptures. And we need to look at all of it, right? Even the stuff that can be tricky sometimes. So I'm excited about that. But I'm also excited because our discussion about money, giving, generosity, all of those things is absolutely mission critical as we talk about moving forward as a church and pursuing the mission of Jesus. It's absolutely critical. And so that's kind of that's kind of the tension that I'm legitimately experiencing this morning. And I figured the best way to deal with that is just to say it out loud. So I'm going to do my best this morning to talk about the scriptures in a way that is accurate, that is truthful, that is challenging. But I would never want to communicate to anybody here, especially if you're watching or if you're here for the first time, that God just wants your money, right? That's not true at all. God wants you. He wants your heart. He loves you. And in fact, right, when it comes to us and money, we don't really even want something from you. We want something for you. Because when we talk about this subject of giving, it actually makes a big difference for us, the giver. Okay, so that's the disclaimer as we dive in to talk about this. We're in the third week of a 4-part series called This Is Us, and we're talking about what does it mean as a church family for us to stack hands around the mission of Jesus. And we've talked about this. The mission of Jesus is to make disciples. It's the mission that God gave his disciples. It's the mission that God gave the church, and it's our mission. We want to be a church that reaches Burke and beyond everywhere with the life-changing message of Jesus. It's who we are. It's what we're about. And it's the thing that if we're going to make progress in that, there are some core commitments that we collectively as a family have got to stack hands around. We've talked about 2 of them already. The first week we talked about growing, that if we're going to make progress in pursuing the mission of Jesus, we've got to be a church family that grows up in our faith, not just older in our faith, right? Because for the church to make progress in the mission of Jesus, we need mature members. Right, that's a big deal. Last week, we talked about the idea of serving. We talked about the idea that God has a part for you to play, so we need you to play your part. That God has handpicked a role for each one of us to play within the body of Christ for the purpose of building up the body and moving the mission of Jesus forward. So we've talked about growing, we've talked about serving, and this morning, we're going to talk about the topic of giving. Because it is so important if we are, as a church family, going to move forward in pursuing the mission of Jesus, we've got to stack hands financially around supporting the mission of Jesus. It's really true. And we're going to go after this morning by looking at some teaching on giving that the Apostle Paul gave to Christians living in the city of Corinth. Last week, we looked at what he said in 1 Corinthians. This morning, we're going to be looking at something that Paul says to believers in the book of 2 Corinthians. And to set it up for you, Paul is what has, I never say the word right, precipitated. That's water, right? Precipitate. It's like the word like came before it. We'll just say that. Say it. Preceded. Wow, that's really bad. That's okay. Anyway, what got this started is that Christians living in Jerusalem were having a hard time and were facing difficulty and hardship and suffering. And so the Apostle Paul is organizing a collection effort, a relief effort from churches in the Mediterranean area to send an offering, to take an offering to the Christians in Jerusalem to help support them and provide relief through the suffering and the difficulty that they're facing. And what Paul has to say in 1 Corinthians 9 is directly tied to that. It's instructions about that particular offering. But what Paul teaches about giving, I think helps us, points a way forward for all of us when we think about how we should think about giving and supporting the mission of the local church. So grab your Bibles, open up if you would to 2 Corinthians chapter 9. We're going to start right in chapter 9, verse 1. And again, Paul's giving them instructions about this collection that they're taking for the saints in Jerusalem. So in verse 1, he says, "Now, it is superfluous for me," I can say superfluous, but not preceded. "Now it is superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry for the saints," the saints in Jerusalem. That's the collection he's talking about. "For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia has been ready since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I am sending the brothers so that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this matter, so that you may be ready, as I said you would be. So that you may be ready, as I said you would be. Otherwise, if the Macedonians come with me and find that you're not ready, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you, for being so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead to you and arrange in advance the gift you have promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not an exaction." So the Apostle Paul begins this teaching. He tells the Corinthians a couple of things. One, he commends them for their generosity. He was like, hey, you guys were one of the first ones who were ready to give, and you've committed a generous amount to help the saints in Jerusalem. He commends them for their generosity, and he lets them know that their generosity has actually been an example to other churches in the Mediterranean region, right? Your generosity has inspired generosity in others. And then Paul instructs them, encourages them, hey, so thank you for being so generous. Please give the gift you promised. Like, please be ready. And I'm going to send some of the brothers to help get everything in order so that the gift is ready, so that, he doesn't want to be embarrassed. But he's thanking them for their generosity. He's encouraging them that their generosity has actually motivated others. And he's encouraging them to be faithful and give the gift that they promised. And now he's going to give them a little bit of teaching. He's going to talk about their attitude toward their giving, and he's going to talk about how they should think about or how they should plan their giving. Listen to what he says in verse 6. And this is a verse, let me tell you, this is a verse that I think gets confused often. So listen to what it says in verse 6. The point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will reap bountifully. Now, in these verses, Paul is using an idea that they would all be familiar with, right? He's talking about farming, right? And he makes a very simple point. He was like, right, what kind of crop do you want to get? Do you want to get a little crop? Well, just plant. You know what happens if you just plant a few seeds, a few plants grow up, right? If you want a big harvest, you got to sow the whole field, right? Like that's the example that he's using. But what is he trying to get at? Why is he using this example, and what is he trying to teach them? I think this verse gets misused often by folks who want to communicate the idea that if you give God $1, he'll give you 10 back. I think a lot of times this verse and verses like this are used in support of that kind of idea. That it's like, well, listen, if you want to get God to bless you, well, then you got to step out in faith and you got to give on the front end. And if you give God a dollar, he'll give you 10. And and it's like, I don't think that's not what Paul is getting at all in these verses. And I actually think that idea, honestly, is anti-gospel. I think that idea that if I give this, that somehow obligates God to give me something back. I think that flies in the face of the gospel. Because the point of the gospel, right, is that we were helpless and hopeless and lost in our sin, right? And God was generous first. And God has given us everything that we need. And our generosity is meant to be a response to God's generosity, not some kind of way to twist God's arm into giving us more. And I just say, I don't want to, make a big thing of it, but for all of us, if all of us, we live in the United States of America. You got your 10. It's like we're blessed, in so many ways. And so I don't think this is Paul teaching, or I'm confident. This is not Paul teaching that what kind of blessing do you want to get from God? That's not the point he's trying to make. The point that Paul is trying to make, he's asking them the question, what kind of difference would you like to make in the lives of people? Because that's why we give. Do you know why we give to help people in need? Because there are people in need. So Paul's point is, what kind of difference would you like to make? Do you want to make a big difference? Well, then give generously. Do you want to make a little difference? Well, then just give a little bit. That's his point. And I think that should be the attitude that we have as believers who are following Jesus. We want to give, so it's the challenge to give according or give in light of the kind of difference you would like to make. That's how we're to think about. That's how we're to process our giving. God, I could really help here. Is this somewhere you want me to help? Is this a way I can step in? I would like to make a difference. Not because, God, I'm somehow if I give, I'm gonna twist your arm. That's really not generosity. If anything, that's investing, maybe. Like if, here's the ROI on, what I'm gonna, that kind of thing. But that's not who we're called to be. We're gospel people. We give because God has already been generous. Okay, I've talked enough about that. All right. So Paul encourages them that they should give according to the kind of difference they want to make. And now he gives them some instructions about how they're to think about, how they're to logistically, how they're to plan out their giving. Listen to this. Verse 8, each one must give as he has decided in his heart. That's important. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. I love this because Paul is encouraging these believers. Listen, don't just give because you feel guilty. Don't give because everyone else is doing it. Don't get, it's like, that's not how you're to think about your giving. You're to think about your giving intentionally. So he's telling these believers, he's like, I want you to decide ahead of time what you're going to give. In other words, I want you to make a plan. You should have a plan to be generous. Your generosity should be thought out ahead of time. And I think that's important. That protects us in a lot of ways, right? That protects us from irresponsible giving. It's possible to give irresponsibly, right? If you're not paying the bills at home and you can't feed the kids, and you're just giving, that's not responsible. We have a responsibility to care for our family, all of that kind of stuff. And so planning ahead of time helps us avoid irresponsible giving, and it helps us involve giving out of guilt or compulsion, which none of that honors God. And so Paul instructs these believers, here's how you should think about your giving. You should decide ahead of time. And that's something that should be between you and God. And if you're married, between you, your spouse, and God. The three of you should get together and figure out, God, what is it that you want us to give? What kind of difference do you want us to make? How are you challenging us? And then how you sense God is leading you, do that. Obey God and give in that direction. Does that make sense? So Paul is challenging these believers. It's like, look, give in accordance with the kind of difference you want to make. But don't just give haphazardly. Don't give accidentally. Give intentionally. Make a plan. Have a plan. Follow the leadership of God and give what you've decided in your heart ahead of time to give. And then he encourages the believers that God will help them, will enable them to keep the promises that they've made, that God will enable them to be faithful to give the gift that he's led them to give. Okay, listen to what he says. Verse 8. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. And in this context, what's the good work that he's talking about? This offering that they're collecting, right? God's going to help you abound in this good work. He's going to help you be faithful. Verse 9, as it is written, and he quotes here from Psalm 112, he has distributed freely. He has given gifts to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. It says God will supply. God will be the one who enables you to give generously. And listen in verse 12. You will be enriched in every way, and here's the purpose, to be generous in every way, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. So Paul is teaching these believers, listen, God's the one who is going to enable you to be generous, right? Because God's the one who supplies our needs. God's the one who cares for us. He gives us everything that we have. And part of the reason that God gives us the resources that we have is so that we can be generous and serve others. But Paul encourages them that it's like not only is your giving going to help the people that you're giving to, that you're serving, it's actually going to bring praise and honor and glory to God. Look at what he says next. Verse 12. For the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, that's the saints in Jerusalem who will be the recipients of this offering, but is also overflowing in many thanksgivings to God. By their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission, your willingness to give, your submission that comes from your confession of the gospel of Christ and the generosity of your contribution for them and for all others, while they long for you and pray for you because of the surpassing grace of God upon you. Thanks be to God for his inexpressible gift. Did you catch it? Paul connected their generosity to the gospel. Did you catch it in the verses? It was in verse 13. By their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission that comes from your confession of the gospel. Our generosity is tied to, is connected to the gospel of Jesus. In other words, because God has been generous to us, we can be generous and serve and care for one another. Because God has given us everything that we need, we don't have to be hoarders. We don't have to live selfishly. We can actually take the risk of being generous to others because we're not the only ones, caring for us. God is caring for us. God is supplying our needs. And ultimately, we're going to be with him forever. So even if we're not millionaires in this life, we're going to be with God forever, and we have absolutely everything that we need. And so the gospel actually frees us to serve and love and be generous and give selflessly to others. Responsibly, of course, but selflessly and generously. So, what do we do with this? I want to challenge us, and by the way, now we're moving into the part that I'm more nervous about, right? Our response, I think we should follow Paul's advice. The idea that our giving, our generosity, it really does make a difference. So we should make a plan to give. Your giving makes a difference, so make a plan to give. And I don't have any hesitancy, honestly. I don't have any hesitancy telling you that if you are a follower of Jesus, if you're walking with Jesus, if you've turned to God in faith and he's rescued you and you've been adopted into his family, you have a responsibility to be generous financially. You have a responsibility to support the work of the ministry financially. It's who we're called to be. And so, but your giving, it really does make a difference. So my challenge is to make a plan to give. Decide ahead of time. If you're married, you and your spouse get together and seek God's leadership and ask him, God, what kind of difference are you calling us to make? And give according to that. Now, I asked Alan, our wonderful executive pastor who runs all the budget stuff at Knollwood, and who is not here this morning. Everybody that I'm calling out is not here this morning. Who's not here this morning, but I asked him could he does the books. I don't pay attention to that. Also, you should know this. I don't know who gives what and how much, and that's intentional. I learned that from Pastor Mark years ago. He had always said, listen, I don't want to know who gives, and I don't want to know how much people give. I don't want there to be any chance that kind of information is going to somehow, that can get weird, and so I always respected him for that, and that's one of the things that I've adopted, that I've learned from him, and so I've asked to be kept in the dark about that. I don't know who gives, I don't know who gives what, I don't know any of that, and I don't want to know. But Alan does know, so if he looks at you funny, no, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. I shouldn't make jokes about this. But I asked Alan to, since he works with the finance team, works with the budget, to give me some statistics that I can share with you related to giving for the purpose, at least this is what I'm going for. The purpose is inspiration. So I'm attempting to inspire all of us toward generosity. And so I asked Alan to give me some statistics on this. And so my intention is not to create guilt. So can we all just agree collectively that we're in a guilt-free zone? But I do want to share some statistics here. And the purpose is inspiration. And so this is the part that I'm nervous about, saying all this stuff. Okay. So I asked, so here's some information kind of about sort of giving at Knollwood. And Alan was using very technical language, and I'm not a finance person at all, so I may say some of this wrong, but I do have it written on my card. Here's one. I don't know if I'm supposed to say average or median, okay? There you go. So, but the average gift at KCC is about 5% of people's income. So in general, maybe if you've been around the church for a long time, you've heard of tithing, right? Where people decide ahead of time to give kind of 10% of their income, and that's kind of their giving, right? And so this is kind of Alan looking at that, and I think he kind of took the median income and kind of did whatever math he did. But he said, in general, around here, people give about 5% of their income. And you should be congratulated on that. He told me, he was like, hey, make sure you congratulate them for that, because the national average in evangelical churches is about 2%. On the whole, in general, Christians give about 2% of their income to the work of ministry. I know, isn't that, some of your faces like just turned. Isn't that unbelievable? I know. But you guys are above average, so congratulations on that. Thank you for that. Okay, now here's the other statistic that I thought was interesting and that kind of made me stand up for a minute, okay? And here's how he wrote it. He said, so we use this term giving units, which has got to be the coldest term I've ever heard. It's like, but then when I started asking him about it, it's like, well, you could say families, but it's not everybody fits into a neat box. And so it's like, it's tricky to figure out what you say there. Is it all right? Can I just say families? I'll just say family. Is that okay? Or folks. I thought maybe I could say our folks, or something like that. But all right, instead of giving units. But anyway, 21 families are providing half of the income at Knollwood. Now that made me stand up a little. I was like, wait, what? Really? Because I don't know if that's shocking for you, but that's shocking for me. It's like 21 of the families or folks or giving units are providing half of the income around here. And while that made me so grateful for those 21 families, that really kind of made me stand up, and I was like, wow, all of a sudden, what happens if we go to 20 families? Or not, it's like that feels precarious maybe a little bit. And that was a statistic he gave me that was like, oh, wow, really? Then he gave me this one that I thought he was really hopeful. So, and this is the one that was the inspirational part for me. He said, he told me this, if 106 of our folks were giving 10% of their, and again, this math was based on, he kind of did the median income of this area, right? So it's not a precise thing, and we're all over the map, right? That kind of thing. But basically, he was like, functionally, we would double if 106 of our folks were giving at the 10% level. We would, for the rest of this year, we'd have a budget of about 1.3 million. Which I just blew me. And I think right now, what did he say? It's like 644 is what is projected. So it would almost double. And that's what made me think, gosh, what could we do as a church family? What could we do to love and serve our community with those kinds of resources? It got me so fired up. One of the things that it got me thinking about was Moses got a phone. Moses is one of Moses' big responsibilities is outreach. As our associate pastor, he focuses on outreach. And so he has been in contact with the folks over at the Burke School, which is a school that serves families that have special needs students at various severities. And I think there was, you don't remember off the top of your head, but it was like 30, 40, 50 families or something. It was something like that, and that's fine. We have no idea. It wasn't 100. It was less than 100. It was a 2-digit number, but I think it was like 30 or 40 families there. And I just thought, that was the first thing I thought of. Gosh, what could we do? What could we do to serve families at this school with those kinds of resources? What could we do? Could we do nights out for the parents because if you're a parent of a special needs kid, it's like, nights out are like gold. It's like that. It's like how could we serve? How could we serve the teachers? Or I just started thinking about all of the things that we could do. What if it were possible for us to fund like starting point groups in every neighborhood in Burke Center? What if everybody who lived in Burke Center was within walking distance of the gospel? I don't know. I just started kind of processing out loud, what could we do with those kind of resources? And it was inspiring to me. So, maybe it's inspiring to you. I don't know. But here's where I wanted to land in terms of a challenge for us. And this was difficult for me. Because there's so many different ways that you could go with a challenge, right? You could challenge people to dollar amounts, right? We want everybody to give, that kind of thing. You could challenge each other, to percentage amount. We could get a big thermometer and put it, there was lots of things that we could do, but none of that felt right to me. As I prayed about it, thought about it, here's what felt right to me. I think the goal for us is not a dollar amount. I think it's a participation goal, honestly. Because the truth is, if you were to ask me what you should give, I have no idea what you should give. I don't have any idea what you should give. That's something you got to figure out between you and the Lord, and what is responsible, but what is also sacrificial and generous and based on the kind of difference you want to make and obedient to the Lord. There's lots of questions you have to answer in terms of figuring out what you should give. So I don't want to be involved. Honestly, I don't want to be involved in that discussion. That's between you and the Lord. But what I do think we ought to do is have a participation goal. And what I mean by that is that for all of us, and I want to be clear about who I'm talking to. If you're here for the first time, if you're here for a couple times, we're so glad that you're here. I'm not aiming this at you. I'm aiming it at all of us who have said, Knollwood is my home. Knollwood is my church family. I am invested in the mission at Knollwood. If that's you, that's who I'm talking to. For all of us, 100% of us who would say, that's how I identify. Knollwood's my family. Knollwood's my church home. Knollwood's the place where I'm trying to stack hands around the mission of Jesus. Well, this is one way I'm going to stack hands. I'm going to make a plan. I'm going to decide ahead of time. I'm going to pick a percentage or whatever it is you do, and I'm going to decide ahead of time, here's how I'm going to give. Here's how I'm going to support the mission of the church. And I think for all of us, I think the appropriate goal is 100% participation at whatever level God has led you to give at, but we should all be involved. It's one of the ways that we stack hands as a church family around the mission of Jesus. And what could we do? How could God use us in this community if we were a church family that had committed to growing up in our faith, not just older in our faith? If we were a church family who has committed to understanding that God has a part for me to play, so I'm going to play my part. And if we were a church family that said, I am going to make a plan to give to support the work that God is doing, I think God could use us in all kinds of ways. And that excites me. And I hope that it excites you too. And so to close, I want us just to take a moment to think about that. So I wanted to do a reflection question for us just to take a couple of minutes to reflect on. And so I was making a joke earlier. Yeah, the question should be, so reflect on how much money God, that was a joke, but they don't all win. They don't all go, but it's fine. But that's not the question. Here's the question I want you to think about. Here's how I want you to reflect on, because it really is bigger than all of this. I want you to think about as it relates to the stacking hands around the mission of Jesus. What excites you about that? So here's the reflection question. It's going to come up on the screen. What about stacking hands around the mission of Jesus gets you excited? When you think about us as a church family, joining together, stacking hands, coming together around the mission of Jesus, what fires you up about that? Take a moment, reflect on that, think about that. Katie's going to come and close us.